Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Confabulating. We're delighted to be joined today by Dr. Andrew Moore of St. Jerome's University, who will be delivering a talk on experiencing climate change in the Middle Ages. Andrew is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Saskatchewan and teaches medieval history at St. Jerome's University, where he teaches the courses Crusading in the Middle Ages, Medieval Monsters, and Environmental and Climate History Pre-Industrial. He holds his PhD in history from the University of Waterloo, where he also gained his BA and MA from that same university. He's a co-investigator for the University of Waterloo's Digital Research Arts and Graphical Environmental Networks, or Dragon Lab, as part of the SHRHC-funded project Environment of Change, directed by Professor Stephen Bednarski, and Andrew serves as the research facilitator for that project. He published in 2022 the article Draining the Swamp, National and Local Regulation of Drainage in a 1396 English Sewer Commission report, in the journal Speculum with Stephen Bednarski, as well as Gamifying History, Designing and Implementing a Game-Based Learning Course Design Framework, published in 2021 in Teaching and Learning Inquiry, the ISSOTL Journal, along with Kyle W. Schultz and Jolanta N. Komonitska. In 2021, he was awarded the designation University Finalist for the Governor General's Gold Medal for his dissertation, Manorial Regulation and Negotiation in a Late Medieval Environment, Land and Community, at Herstmonceux, 1308 to 1440. Andrew, thanks so much for joining us this evening. It's fantastic to have you here.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to it. This is going to be great.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll just dive right in here. Share my screen. Okay. So before going into some detail about how people experienced climate change in the Middle Ages, I will explain first how we can reconstruct the environmental conditions in a past era. To do this, a number of historians have embraced a relatively new and constantly evolving perspective on historical issues. So what do we mean when we say environmental history? What concepts might be important to this perspective, and how can we problematize them? So take environment, for example. Is that only organic things? What about places that are mostly organic? Do cities count? How about oil fields? People's homes? All these questions. How about history? Traditionally, the written narratives about the human past. But can we take it further than that? Oral histories? Or what about even experiences and events that aren't documented by humans at all? What about nature? Environment without people. But is such a thing even possible anymore? It's a hypothetical, idealized concept. So we could take culture, the beliefs and rituals of people, basically the things tying us together socially and in our own minds. Not much room for nature there. But is anything we do and think totally separate from the environments in which we live? As environmental historians, we're looking for the intersection of nature and culture. Two idealized concepts that occupy polar opposites. So no people and only people. We're looking for that sweet spot right in the middle. We want to see where the two meet, which is really where most, if not almost all, of human experience actually occurs. Okay, so we know for what we're looking, but how do we find it? How do we analyze it? Where do historical disciplines traditionally find their data? There are written sources, oral accounts, other historical studies, direct observation even. Essentially data, primary and secondary, created by humans. But what might be some limitations when studying historical environment? Things happen in nature beyond human understanding. Different peoples throughout history have had different ideas of what nature even is. Or maybe the details are so mundane that you don't write them down. Most of us don't describe the trees or insects we see on our way into work, never mind write all these details down for a future society to analyze. And especially since past societies were mostly non-literate, so what was written down was only what was considered most important, and that rarely had anything to do with environmental topics. But the Earth has its own story to tell, in effect, a natural archive. We can analyze naturally occurring preserved materials that substitute or stand in place as proxies for an absence of or to complement anthropogenic records. This means developing a strong interdisciplinary skill set, or more commonly, collaborating with scientists. So what kinds of proxy data exist? Scientists take ice cores from ice sheets and glaciers, which can show us historical temperature and atmospheric conditions. Or some use dendrochronology, the counting and measuring of tree rings. They take cores from living or dead trees or from historical buildings to show us historical climate conditions, especially precipitation. Or others use palynology, the study of spores and pollen grains, to show us historical vegetation. Others look at things like mineral deposits found in caves, known as speleothems, basically stalactites and stalagmites, to show us historical precipitation and vegetation. And still others look for marine fossils, foraminifera, often called forams, which are single-celled marine organisms with a shell that are easily fossilized to show us historical sea level change and marine conditions. Where these things exist, the sea once encroached, for example. All of these data paint us a picture of what the climate was like in historical eras, before modern meteorological tracking. And this exciting research presents a much more textured view of what was happening in, say, the Middle Ages. But we also don't want to lose the people in the story. This is where the environmental historian comes in. And so with this perspective, we can begin to find all sorts of clues in historical documents to what their world was like. Even though people don't usually write down all the everyday things they experience, in fact, often the most representative things can actually be underrepresented for this reason, we can begin to piece together all sorts of details. And while collecting mundane data, we can also begin to look at exceptional things too, because it shows what people care about. When someone writes something down, especially in a society where most people can't read or write, and it's very expensive, it must be really important. And also, what do people fight over? People generally don't have disputes over things that don't matter. So in a court case, we get examples of important, noteworthy things. And we also can keep our eyes peeled for mundane references to show what they consider normal. The good interdisciplinary historian combines all these tools together: scientific proxy data to give the broad contours of the environment and the climate, archaeological reports for physical evidence of their lives, and historical documents for how they saw and experienced their world. This all frames the perspective and context that a historian uses to understand the evidence in the records. And we also need certain skills, since our specialty is always first and foremost the documents themselves. So medieval Latin is an important thing for these sorts of records. Paleography, which is the reading of ancient handwriting, all of these things are important to sort of include in your toolkit. So to shift to what's actually happening in the Middle Ages, what has all this told us about late antiquity and the Middle Ages? During the final centuries of the Western Roman Empire, the Roman warm period, sometimes called a climate optimum, was coming to an end. The destabilization and collapse of ancient institutions and agroecological systems, proceeding very slowly throughout the late Roman Empire, accelerated drastically in the 5th and 6th centuries, much of it due to a series of significant environmental events. Climate played a factor in the context of wider societal changes, though, of course, not the only factor. The most significant and drastic discontinuities between classical Mediterranean and early medieval Europe involved how people lived on and utilized the land. So there are 5 major changes in land use that we can determine from this time. On both sides of the imperial border, people moved away from their old farms. Villages in the south, clustered farmsteads in the north. Many urban centers were abandoned, or at least much less densely populated. People in general moved from valley bottoms to higher ridges and hills. They began to build more and more with timber rather than the masonry that the Romans used so much. They began to organize their fields differently, and old Roman boundaries, ditches, and smaller roads were forgotten. Fields had always been more square in shape, but now generally followed a system of longer strips. And until the 6th century, rural settlements mostly followed the ancient boundaries and field patterns. But by the 8th century, farmers were creating new and different field plans, and especially with Christian churches and chapels forming the core of agricultural communities. Grain farming lost some of its dominance in those centuries, and wine and olive growing shrunk back from the northern inroads it had made during the warmer times. More and more reliance on domestic livestock, especially cattle and pigs, and on using woodland. And this was more in line with traditional northern agricultural systems, not so much what the Romans had been doing. And these socioeconomic changes and decline in human populations meant that Europe underwent a so-called renaturing process between the 5th and 8th centuries. Woodlands regenerated in many places, and it seems that some animal populations, especially large fish in rivers, recovered as well. By the year 1000, roughly, Western Europe had broadly developed a distinctive culture and economic system during what is commonly called the High Middle Ages. It occurred, as many other instances of efflorescence do, to use Bruce Campbell's term, in an era of very stable and generally warm and dry, but not too dry, climate. This is commonly called the medieval warm period, or medieval climate optimum, or medieval climate anomaly. During the warmest phases of the warm period, it seems the temperature rose by about 1 degree Celsius compared to the later Little Ice Age. 1 degree is significant, especially since different regions are affected differently. Weather conditions were also much more consistent and predictable. There weren't the frequent and severe storms that characterized the cold periods before and after. So no surprise then that this is when the Vikings expanded throughout the Atlantic and that trade routes were so successful throughout Europe and Asia. In some parts of the world, the warm and stable conditions were offset by very dry conditions, which led to drought in some parts of the Americas, Africa, and Asia. But in Northern Europe, the strong North Atlantic oscillation brought winds up to Northern Europe and kept precipitation frequent and consistent. This provided a massive advantage for Northern European farmers, especially compared to the increasingly dry Mediterranean. So, during this time, Northern Europe was experiencing an excellent climate for environmental stability and optimal agricultural conditions. Crop yields were quite good overall, and there were few environmental crises that upset the demographic growth. Europe, with these good climate conditions, experienced an era of relative stability and expansion. The population of the entire world increased significantly between 1100 and 1300, with double the number of people since 600. In Eurasia alone, there are 329 million people estimated. And especially there was the proportional increase for Europe between 1200 and 1340. It went from less than half compared to the population of China to even more people over a relatively short period of time. Now, this is as much to do with the upheaval of the Mongol invasions of China as it does Europe's expansion, but Europe's population does basically double between 1100 and 1340. But even in Europe, these increases were not equal everywhere. Drier Mediterranean areas and areas of Russia invaded by the Mongols had below average growth, whereas Northern Europe, Britain, France, Germany, Scandinavia, and the Low Countries, their populations in some places, to some extent, tripled. This unprecedented population increase allowed for a number of societal developments, but also strained available resources too. So climate was an important factor that helped, or at least didn't hinder, food production and population growth. Technological adoption and innovation were major factors too. Italy and China long had substantial populations with farming systems well suited to each of their climates. But how did Northern Europe come to have as much or even more population? Sure, the land is very fertile. Glaciers rendered the soil very, very fertile for crops. But it's also generally much heavier and wetter soil, much harder to work the land than in the light Mediterranean soils or the well-irrigated river valleys of China. And so there were 4 major technical innovations in the High Middle Ages that were particularly suited to intensive farming in Northern Europe. To use an important piece of equipment, invented sometime in the earlier Middle Ages, began to spread rapidly in the High Middle Ages. It goes by many names in different regions, but is basically the heavy plow, which includes a mold board. Unlike older plows used elsewhere, which scratch the earth and are able to make drier, lighter soils crumble, this one scoops the earth and actually flips it over. This allows heavy soils to be turned over and reused more effectively. It also pushes excess water out of the ground, which is important in much wetter northern Europe. It also leads to the ridge and furrow style of landscape, which is very distinctive for that area and allows effective drainage by using the furrows to direct water. But it had technical and thus environmental implications. It required a stronger team to pull such a heavy plow through heavy soil. This meant more demand for cereals, meant more land, which meant more draft animals, which thus meant more land for the animals to graze on. One solution was to use a stronger animal, especially if they ate the same thing you were growing in the fields anyway. So that is, of course, the horse. But a horse requires a different shaped collar than the oxen. So the invention of one specially for horses was an important agricultural innovation. It allowed for more efficient plowing, plus horses could be used for transporting goods and people. But not everyone switched to using horses because they have some disadvantages compared to oxen. Working horses need to eat specialized fodder. They can't just graze. So it means farmers needed to produce even more crops. There were also cultural prohibitions against eating horses, which meant they could only be used for work, where oxen could be eaten as a source of meat if they were no longer able to plow. And the choice between horse and oxen essentially came down to more intensive farming in a smaller space or less intensive over a larger space. Another important innovation allowed for more efficient farming compared to previous systems, which was important to feed this rapidly expanding population and increased use of horses as draft animals. This is known as the three-course rotation, or the three-field system. It's superior to the two-field system, which had worked quite well for the Romans, as soils there were drier and less fertile, and so they needed to rest every other year and collect enough nutrients and water for the next crop. So how does the three-field system work? In northern soils, more fertile and wetter, it did not need those restrictions. And so it could hold crops 2 out of 3 years. And so they would rotate between winter and spring crops and then leave it fallow in the 3rd year. The advantages is it cuts down on erosion, but most importantly, it leads to increased output, an extra 17% generally. Also, growing spring grains, oats and barley, provided animal fodder and beer and porridge, respectively. And with all the grains being grown, there was more and more need for efficient grinding of the grain, for which you need a mill. Water mills were the predominant form of mill in northern medieval Europe, but they went through several iterations, each more efficient than the last. Classical mills tended to be horizontal, which would spin with the current. They work pretty well on small, fast streams, like in much of Mediterranean Europe and Southwest Asia. But eventually, vertical water wheels became more popular, although for a long time, they were mostly undershot, where the water goes underneath the wheel. It's more efficient than horizontal and could handle waterways with a slower stream. But then the overshot wheel was invented and began to spread. It is much more efficient because it adds the power of gravity from a 3-meter drop. And so water wheel innovations throughout the Middle Ages created 3 or 4 times more efficient energy generation. Roman mills generated something like 1,800 watts, compared to 500 to 600 watts for a draft animal. Later medieval overshot mills were more like 6,500 watts. And so altogether, these 4 innovations allowed for better and better yields, which allowed for more and more food surplus in Northern Europe. So what developments did this encourage? The food surplus allowed more and more people to live in cities. More than ever before, cities took on economic and industrial functions beyond just being the center of political and ceremonial religious life. The fact that a smaller and smaller share of people needed to focus on food production, still 85 to 90% were producing food, but it did allow people to specialize in different occupations. You could be a blacksmith or a cooper or a farrier or a merchant or a scribe, etc., etc. And this is unsurprisingly also when we get the rapid expansion of guilds representing different groups and eventually regulating industries. Cities also manage themselves carefully with complex regulations around behavior, with many of them around waste management, maintaining sewers, paving and cleaning streets, enforcing bylaws, determining how much waste a butcher or a dye maker could create, for example. And because of all this, for the first time, a number of northern cities like Paris and London exceeded 50,000 people, which is still small compared to the hundreds of thousands or even millions in the Mediterranean or the Islamic world, places like Rome, Constantinople, and Baghdad, but quite a change for Northern Europe. And these cities require more and more energy flowing into them, which requires more and more agricultural output from their hinterlands. And so farms spread further into areas that were even less conducive naturally to farming ecologies. Farmers everywhere are thus transforming landscapes into areas fit for intensive agriculture. Lords allow or even encourage their tenants to clear spaces in the woods for them to use. This significantly expands the footprints of many estates and led to one of the worst deforestation episodes in world history, especially during the 1100s, around the midpoint of the High Middle Ages. Take modern day France, for example. Not the same as the medieval boundaries, but in modern day France is 55 million hectares. In Charlemagne's day, around 800, 30 million of them were wooded. By the end of the 1200s, only 13 million were wooded. So it's a 56% decline in woodland over that time. England around the same time was down to being just 6% wooded by 1348. By the 1200s, people were realizing this posed a potentially major crisis, especially since wood was so essential. And so they began generally everywhere and at a mostly local level to create regulations limiting use of woods. And so woodlands did recover to some extent even before the 14th century crisis, which we'll discuss in a minute. People were also draining more and more lands for farmland, which can lead to fertile fields, but also requires constant vigilance and maintenance, and can mean places more vulnerable to changes in storms and sea levels become inhabited during the good times. The flurry of activity in the High Middle Ages, with more places to do business, like markets, fairs, guild halls, etc., meant that money took on more and more of an important role. This allowed international trade to flourish and also meant more people wanted money and goods from elsewhere. And so we get a widespread movement of people and resources all throughout the so-called Old World. This created unprecedented monetary wealth and economic growth for many parts of the world, plus a better understanding of how their world worked and what other cultures were out there, but also in an important way made societies vulnerable, similar in some ways to what globalization can do now. It's good for humans in many ways, but also means that you're not just susceptible to local factors. Now something in Italy might affect China and vice versa. They also faced theoretically what is called a Malthusian trap, which results in a Malthusian catastrophe or crisis. It's based on a now old economic idea, which basically states the population growth tends to be exponential. I think we see that in the modern world, certainly today. Whereas the production of a food supply or other resources tends to be linear. Eventually, population tends to overreach food availability, and the theory states that there will be a crisis, which is usually war, famine, or disease. And in this way, nature supposedly is seeking to restore equilibrium. On the surface, there seems to be much evidence for this, which is why it still gets so much traction, even more than 200 years after it was written. Human history is full of examples where overpopulation was met with tragic crises, where the population was brought down again. The issue with the theory is that it is an overly simple explanation for usually a very complex phenomenon. It's not necessarily inevitable. It doesn't take into account, for example, people moving around when we get mass migration episodes, or new technological advances like the medieval ones I just mentioned, or modern artificial fertilizers, etc. And the theory argues that the Malthusian trap will cause a crisis, where it might just make a society more susceptible to exogenous factors, that is, those originating from an external source. So let us now consider what happens when a society that has been experiencing unprecedented population growth and moving into densely packed cities, and that has been imposing its cultural priorities on the environment and depleting some important resources, comes up against its own series of devastating crises. And so this brings us to the 14th century, an absolutely horrible century for Europe, really for the entire world, and one where everything seems to be collapsing almost all at once. And we are so far beyond the high Middle Ages here, and this is why this era becomes generally known as the late Middle Ages. And it's often a popular century to study because of the absolute chaos that is going on. And this really seemed like the apocalypse for people living through it. I'll go into famine and disease in more detail in a minute, but just as a quick mention, I'll go over the second two on the list here. Massive and long-term wars broke out throughout Eurasia. Most significantly, the brutal conquest throughout Asia by Timur as his attempted restoration of Genghis Khan's Mongol Empire, and the 100 Years' War between England and France and their allies, plus a number of popular peasant revolts throughout Europe as people reacted to the uncertain times. Also at this time, the medieval warm period was beginning to come to an end, leading to what is known as the Little Ice Age. It was beginning slowly to get colder, but especially wetter and more unpredictable storms. It had some impact on warfare. There's stories of a hailstorm in 1360 allegedly killing 1,000 English soldiers, but mostly it had an impact on famine and disease, as we'll see. The 14th century crises began with the Great European Famine, which struck Europe, especially Northern Europe, from 1315 to 1322. It was the worst famine ever seen in Europe up to that point, and one of the worst ever, even up to this day. It affected more than 30 million people in an area over 400,000 square miles, and occurred in a society clearly under population pressure. Though the economy was still growing by the 1310s, it had become sluggish in some areas by the 1250s, and there was very slow growth after 1285. Demand had far surpassed supply, and so it sort of seems like a Malthusian trap. The peak of the famine occurred from 1315 to 1317, but with direct effects persisting until 1322. And more than 10% of the population died, and in some places maybe even as high as a fifth or a quarter, and brought long-term suffering for everyone. So what caused it? The problem seemed to have started with a series of very wet and stormy years, which created both a production and distribution crisis. Dendrochronological and historical chronicle evidence suggests that the 1310s were probably one of the two rainiest decades in the entire Middle Ages. Rains fell consistently throughout 1314, 15, 16, and even part of 17, which caused at least 3 years of failed crops throughout Europe. Rain is good for farming in moderation, but too much, of course, is deadly. In those years, rain fell heavily in the spring when the seeds were scattered, in summer when the sprouts were starting to emerge from the earth, and in autumn during the harvest. This meant that the ground was often too waterlogged, and rust, mildew, and mold spread rapidly. Plus, the winters were exceptionally cold. The Baltic Sea even completely froze over in 1316. And the harshest winter of all was 1317, 1318. And also, severe storms brought further flooding and disruption of food supply networks. Farmers, especially as careful as subsistent farmers had to be, could weather a failed crop or two, but 3 in a row, this was devastating and almost unheard of, especially considering the mild and consistent conditions of previous generations. In all of living memory, this sort of thing would be completely unknown and so unpredicted. To make matters worse, there was a parallel crisis happening at the same time, a series of devastating animal murrains, another word for pandemic diseases, affecting livestock throughout Northern Europe. It began with an outbreak of cattle disease, now widely accepted as a disease called rinderpest, which kills cattle very quickly and painfully. Consider how important cattle are to a farming system: dairy, plowing, and meat. Even worse when you're trying to weather a famine and produce as much food as possible. To make matters even worse, those extremely wet conditions meant hay could not be adequately dried without doing it inside the barn, which risked fires, a very serious threat in the pre-modern world. And the cold just compounded the issue. Many animals froze to death in the brutal winters. Sheep especially were hard hit. A series of parasitic worms, which thrive in wet conditions, can create a deadly infestation in sheep called liver fluke, and the cold winters were very hard on the lambs. And sheep were also, of course, very important in medieval society for wool and meat. The murrains continued right up until 1322 in some places. These diseases together killed as many as 90% of cattle herds and 25 to 50% of sheep, and even 70% of sheep herds in some places. So even if people thought they could replace their waterlogged grains with animal products, they were out of luck during the Great European Famine. And war, which cannot be said to have caused the famine, did make it worse, especially in terms of distribution. Vital food supplies were redirected from families to feed armies on the move, and also fighting disrupted trade networks and sometimes caused damage to farms and fields. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden were fighting each other in those years, as were a number of German princes fighting within the Holy Roman Empire. The French were invading Flanders in modern-day Belgium, and also in the British Isles. After the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, the Scots embarked on a victorious campaign of raiding against the English in northern England and Ireland. And this famine had long-term societal effects. There was cultural upheaval. People believed God was angry with them. There were also widespread reports of infanticide, child abandonment, and even cannibalism. Not coincidence that the story of Hansel and Gretel originated around this time. And most especially, it meant that people suffered and were malnourished for years at a time. Europe recovered only very slowly after 1322 and was still reeling in many ways when the worst pandemic of all time devastated populations all over the world. The second pandemic of the Black Death spread very quickly in the early 1340s. It mutated from reservoirs where it lay dormant in Central Asia, probably in modern-day Kyrgyzstan, and began to spread among rodent populations, especially in fleas carried by these rodents. By 1346, it entered Western Asia and then Europe and North Africa by 1347. Over the next few years, it would wipe out at least a third, and in some places more than half of Europe's population, killing worldwide something like 100 million people. It entered Europe through Crimea, where Mongol armies infected with the disease were besieging a city. Genoese traders then unintentionally carried the disease aboard their ships to all the major ports of the Mediterranean in 1347. And by 1348, it had spread to much of mainland Europe and North Africa, and by 1349 was in almost all regions, except much of Poland. The Black Death was a cataclysmic event in Eurasian history, and is really a watershed between the medieval society before and a transition into what we would call early modern. And so for this reason, we call this new phase of the Middle Ages the late Middle Ages to differentiate from the High Middle Ages. The disease struck quickly and often fatally. People would often develop headaches, sore joints, nausea, vomiting, and fatigue. And in some cases, lumps called buboes grew on their lymph nodes. The disease was usually fatal within just 2 to 7 days. There had been widespread debate about what pathogen actually caused the Black Death. In 1894, Alexander Yersin, a student of Louis Pasteur, discovered the bacterium that causes bubonic plague. It was named after him, Yersinia pestis. Based on similar symptoms, it was quickly identified as the cause of the Black Death over 500 years earlier. Some historians later claimed that there wasn't enough evidence to call it bubonic plague, as that early theory had stated. They had some compelling evidence to argue that it must have been something else, probably influenza or maybe even anthrax. The debate has now been resolved based on an exciting new scientific breakthrough. In 2003, the human genome was completely mapped. And this now allows scientists to analyze the teeth from plague burial pits, and they contain traces of Yersinia pestis. So scientists have been able to prove what historians could only speculate, that it was indeed bubonic plague, which of course still exists today, though mostly dormant, and also antibiotics provide some protection now. And the disease is vector-borne. It requires a host, in this case rodents, and a vector, fleas. Vector-borne diseases are especially influenced by environmental conditions because there are so many creatures involved. The host, the vector's host, and the pathogen itself are all susceptible to environment. The disease is most commonly and originally a bacterial infection, but then it can become septicemic within a person or become pneumonic and then be spread from person to person. Obviously, a big issue in densely packed medieval cities, plus also issues keeping cities clean. If someone had the septicemic or pneumonic versions of the disease, it was almost always 90 to 100% fatal. Only the bacterial had any real chance of survival. And so let's just try to imagine how shocking and scary all this was. Once it entered a city, over half of all those people would be dead within a week. Once you had any symptom, you were more likely to die than not. And if it spread to your blood, septicemic, or lungs, pneumonic, then it was basically a death sentence. And since it was bacterial, they had almost no way to counteract it. They had no antibiotics, for example. They did have some measures. They could tell it was contagious, even though they didn't know why. So good to separate sick people from healthy people. And so in this period, quarantine received its name, although it had been in earlier practice to some extent. Quaranta is the Italian word for 40, of course. So 40 days. This is where quarantine comes from. And how long they would be quarantined at that time. The crises of the 14th century, especially the Black Death, had many cultural and environmental consequences, just some of which I'll touch on here briefly. Most obviously, there was unsurprisingly intense fear that manifested in widespread violence and rejection of authority. Not all of the changes were necessarily negative or critical or obsessed with death, however. For one thing, wages increased significantly throughout Europe. For basically the first time, people could begin to demand a fair wage for their work and ask for it in money rather than just land or labor or something else. And this begins to break down the feudal relationship, especially its ties to the land through the manor. Because it was now more expensive to hire farmhands, and there were just that many fewer mouths to feed. And so many large-scale farms were converted to other uses. Sometimes pasture for animals to roam. Other times, lords would, as a sign of their status and wealth, convert their lands into massive deer parks, which function sort of like a national park today, although not for conservation purposes. They existed to keep a ready supply of prized animals for hunting. But they were carefully managed, with gamekeepers making sure animals thrived and remained in abundant numbers. Woodlands thus regenerated in many places, as did wild land animals and fish species as well. Hunting was more regulated and often confined to enclosed spaces, and farmland was no longer encroaching on wild populations and causing habitat loss. It took global and especially European populations over a century to recover back to their pre-Black Death levels, especially since the plague kept returning in only slightly less severe pandemics every few decades. And so the 14th century witnessed the end of the relatively stable medieval climate anomaly and the beginning of a new volatile climatic era, the so-called Little Ice Age. The impacts of this shift are increasingly well understood on a global and even regional level. Not enough research has yet shown, however, how these changes affected everyday life in local communities. The environmental historian, knowing the context of environment from many sources, including proxy data, can still consider traditional historical documents to see human relations to and experiences of climate change. And I have a longer explanation of this brief case study, but I think I'll keep it very short here, just in terms of time. But as an example, here's a brief case study investigating whether small institutions in the same area of 14th century England adopted different management choices in response to environmental pressures. Specifically here, using court rolls from two manors, Herstmonceux and Wartling, which were located in close proximity and both straddled flood-prone marshlands and uphill woodlands with limited arable potential. Geological, palynological, and dendroclimatological proxy data help us establish the contours of these regional environmental conditions. One manor, Herstmonceux, with a relatively absentee lord and widely dispersed holdings, managed in a largely laissez-faire fashion, and its tenants mostly self-regulated. The other, Wartling, with a more active centralized administration, encountered stiffer resistance from locals to seigneurial attempts at regulation. In general, everyone resisted royal interference. People tended to prioritize personal liability, independence, and custom over collective responsibility and big picture strategies. And this work helps us understand better how climate change manifests on a local level and how communities respond to such pressures. I'm just trying to, how am I doing for time?
All good. Yeah, keep going.
Keep going? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll just find where I am here. Okay. So during largely stable, warm climate regime of the 12th and 13th centuries, as I said, population was booming, labor was plentiful, prices were high, wages cheap, and the environment seemed to be behaving just how humans would like: bountiful harvests, consistent weather, and few major storms or other environmental crises. But of course, in the 14th, things were becoming much more volatile. And in addition to the famine and the Black Death, there was also what historians have dubbed an age of storms. Scientific proxy data helps us understand how a weakening of the North Atlantic Oscillation, which I mentioned before, increased unpredictable and violent weather patterns throughout North Sea. And so coastal England, where these two manors are located, became beset by storm surges and subsequent flooding. Some towns like Winchelsea, just go back for a second, I have old Winchelsea's number 10 on this map, were literally washed away into the sea. And as I said, concurrently to the increased flooding, there was widespread concern over depletion of woodlands. There was that great apex of deforestation in the 12th century. And with wood being so essential to so many aspects of medieval economies, the primary material for construction and fuel, of course, that there was great concern for this deforestation. It's been estimated that between 1086 and 1250, the English destroyed an average of 20 acres of woodland each day. And this had significant ecological effects. Not coincidentally, wolves, wild boars, and beavers all became extinct in England during those times, extirpated from England during those times. And so medieval people instituted clear regulations for the use of woodlands, including new sustainable practices like coppicing and careful restrictions on the amount of wood that any individual could remove. And so for these two manors, we have a situation by the 14th century of humans there managing two disparate and vulnerable ecosystems. One, a reclaimed wetland drained by various means, but constantly at threat of flooding. And another, a vast woodland recently rebounding due to careful management, but always in constant threat of overexploitation. In terms of flooding, we know the area to the south of both manors was increasingly flooded at that time. Contemporaneous Herstmonceux court rolls, however, contain virtually no references to active drainage initiatives or maintenance of infrastructure. In fact, there are only sporadic references even to fishing the waterways or farming the reclaimed area at all. This dearth of evidence from Herstmonceux contrasts notably with what we know of land ownership in the area. People were living in the reclaimed area. Numerous charters attest to the transfer of marshland acres and the creation of bridges, ditches, and seawalls. And we know the Lord of Herstmonceux had political influence in the marsh as well. He was frequently involved in royal commissions regulating drainage, and this was no doubt made even more relevant to him because he had a thriving farm in that area. Some local elites also held manorial land, people who were lords in their own right or very prominent free tenants. They also appear in marshland charters, but only sporadically in court rolls. And so lords and local elites used the reclaimed marsh, but tenants seemingly did not. Oh, I should have had this up before. But how does Wartling differ in this respect? Its manor house just down the road from Herstmonceux occupied the same slightly higher ground on the edge of the marsh. Court rolls there, however, contain much more evidence of active regulation. This should not surprise, though, as Wartling tenants had a long history of access to the reclaimed marshland. As early as 1230, a charter here, shown here, stipulates that the Lord of Wartling agreed to provide to some tenants a watercourse through his marsh for the purposes of drainage. And they agreed to construct at their own expense sufficient watercourses to drain the area. And then the Wartling Manor Court continued to monitor and enforce the maintenance of that infrastructure. So in 1327, for example, shown here, the Lord punished a tenant for insufficient drainage construction. Using timber to create sluices, waterways, is a good segue into how each manor regulated use of its woodland. Tenants' use of wood was generally limited even on their own tenements. They retained some vital access to common areas and rights to gather deadwood for fuel, but the clearing of trees and trade in timber were tightly controlled. Oaks, so valuable for timber, remained beyond the grasp, legally at least, of most people. It could be purchased, but often at exorbitant prices beyond even the annual rent of most tenements. And yet, despite these clear rules and prioritization of woodland sustainability, Herstmonceux court again shows relatively few instances of illicit woodcutting. So 14th century Herstmonceux documents record 600 cases of trespass by animals and people, but fewer than 100 involving wood. And apart from sporadic mentions of other fruit trees like pears and apples, the only tree species mentioned in those records is oak. And this is interesting because we know, of course, oak was plentiful in that region, but there were also many other species of tree. Palynological research using pollen spores has demonstrated widespread alder trees along the edges of that marsh and illustrated secondary forests of birch and hazel in those areas as well, none of which appear in Herstmonceux records. Compare this dearth of documentation with abundant references from nearby Wartling. First, the records include more species variation. The Wartling court describes, just in November 1329, for example, the destruction of an oak, beeches, great birches, and seedling apple trees, as well as vines from a vineyard. Second, the records include much more dispute over rights. When a Wartling tenant faced penalty for cutting down firewood and selling large trees, the community came to his defense and argued that custom dictated they had the right to fell and sell oaks and beeches on their own tenements. The court didn't listen to this claim. Very rarely and only for some freeholders did tenants have that right, and so many infractions continue to occur. And third, the records include a greater scale of woodcutting. Just in 1327, in one instance in 1327, they record that 20 oaks had been cut from just one tenement, and another 40 large trees, including oaks, beeches, and great birches, had been felled in 1329. The discrepancy between the experiences of the two manors is noteworthy, considering their topographical and environmental context, considering what we know of the energy and material requirements provided by wood in the medieval period, and what the records from both tell us about seigneurial concerns to maintain manorial structures, including tenants' own homes. And so these brief case studies show just some examples of the ways that different people and institutions, even ones located in the same geographical context and during the same eras of climatic change, how they experienced that climate change and how they could operate in different ways and prioritize different aspects of land use and natural resources, even during environmentally troubled times. Thank you. Oh, I have a... Yeah.
Good stuff. Brilliant. Thanks so much, Andrew. That was a fantastic, really fascinating discussion. It's extraordinary to see just the sort of the arc of climate in this period and the way that it sort of impacted people's daily lives, but also on a kind of big macro level as well. The way that cities rose, and then, of course, the awful events of the 14th century and the devastating impact that it had on people's lives. It's fascinating to see how climate really underpins every facet of people's lives in this period. But I think so often it gets overlooked in many traditional historical circles.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I guess my first
and that's what we try to do. Sorry, that's what we just try to do as environmental historians is always try to keep the non-human elements in mind, right? It's not to say that it's sort of deterministic how the climate might affect certain things, but it's always underpinning so many things that happen, right?
Absolutely. And out of curiosity, how did this discipline first sort of kick off? I appreciate that there's lots of kind of different threads that probably fed into it, but what's the kind of roots of kind of trying to blend these two kind of spheres together?
That's a great question, actually. Yeah. And so it developed in this sort of late 1960s and 70s out of sort of disparate strands of things that people were already doing. So one was historical geography, which had often looked at many of these questions. And American historical geographers really drove this, really pushed for this looking at this interaction between sort of people and their geographical context, right?
Mhm.
And then also the growing environmentalism movement. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring comes out in the 60s, and that just is such a powerful thing for people when they realize the impact that pesticides were having on the environment, for example.
Mhm.
And so you get a sort of a growing interest in environmentalism coinciding with academic disciplines that had already sort of been doing this, but not for historians. And then people became inspired by the Annales School of History, um, the French Annales School, which had really looked at sort of big picture, longue durée things, mentalités, all these big picture things, right? Even to the point of some looking at, sort of history without names, right? And so all these things created a situation where historians came in and pulled all this together and sort of started then. And then increasingly over time, more and more historians are drawing on interdisciplinary methods on scientific proxy data. For example, ancient DNA now is a major part of studying the Black Death. So yeah, that's basically where it started. But it's who knows where it's going to go from here.
Absolutely, absolutely. It'd be exciting to really see where it develops as the
Yeah,
years go on.
yeah,
And as I say, I think one thing that makes this so unique is the fact that you get this intersection between, I suppose, scientific analysis through the proxy data
mm,
and more
mm,
traditional historical methodology. And I'd
yeah.
be interested, as somebody who admittedly has never had sort of much kind of background with proxy data before, what
Mm,
would you say are sort of the opportunities and challenges of working with this kind of data when conducting historical inquiries?
mm. Yeah, it's a great question. I think I mean, there are a few. There are some historians out there, I think, who have a good scientific background who really know how to sort of analyze the proxy data on its own merits. But for most historians, it really comes down to collaboration with scientists. That's what I've found is that
Mhm.
uh, it's been a bit of a learning curve even for me to read the scientific literature for my own work, and it's been really fruitful in that way. But I only have a sort of superficial grasp of what actually goes into to actually analyzing this proxy data, right? I took a palinology workshop at Princeton years ago, and just trying to identify the pollen spores. It really, great respect for the scientists that do this because it's a totally different world than what I'm used to doing. But then I've also found through collaboration is so important, and what I found through collaboration is
Mhm.
as amazingly difficult and sort of beyond my wheelhouse the proxy data is, the scientists I work with feel the same way about the paleography on the medieval documents, right? They look at the documents
Mhm.
and they think,
Yeah,
how can you read that? And how do you know what the terms mean? And so it is just all about communication across disciplines. And that's, I think, what makes environmental history so interesting is this dialogue among different uh, disciplines, this tearing down of silos, right? I mean, everybody gets
yeah.
as academics, we get very stuck in our own specialties, which become more and more narrow and it's become more expert in something. And so it's good to kind of break down those barriers sometimes and try to understand what how people use pollen spores to reconstruct past vegetation, or what Greenland ice cores can tell us about weather in England, right? Like, yeah,
Yeah,
so it's very, very interesting. Yeah.
that's fantastic. And as you say, I think it's really refreshing to see collaboration between different disciplines.
Mhm.
Especially as academic disciplines become just so much more
Mhm.
specialized and myopic.
Yeah.
It's really great to see.
Yeah.
And you mentioned briefly before some innovations like DNA analysis with Black
Mhm.
Death victims. I'm curious to
Yeah.
know, are there any other kind of major innovations that are just sort of coming through right now in this particular field?
Yes, I mean, this is the thing is the work is always there are always new innovations. And that's the other thing about working with scientists is their fields, the state of their field changes very quickly, even to the point that
Mhm.
uh, with traditional historical uh, with traditional historical discourse, 5 or 10 years is not a massive amount of time to sort of stay up to date on the state of the field. Where with science, it's every few months you have to really be constantly keeping on top of things. And so a few so I put a slide up at the end. Environments have changed, medieval-environment.com, if any audience members are interested in learning more. The research project that I help facilitate does a lot of this, bringing different disciplines together. And so there are different things, and I'm not going to do it justice to what they're working on, but we have people using LiDAR scanners, which is sort of drone-based radar of the ground and vegetation, and they're looking at how coppiced areas, because some woodlands in England, for example, are still coppiced, and looking at how effective coppicing is for biodiversity and sort of density of tree growth and things like that, to sort of try to figure out, well, maybe how successful would it have been in the Middle Ages? Because the coppicing practice is more or less the same, but we now have all these new technologies, digital scanning technologies to help us recreate that. We have people in that marshland that I was describing taking core samples, and somehow, I'm blanking off the top of my head, but they're able to reconstruct along ancient river courses even better than before how much those rivers have sort of moved over time and how much inundation has happened. And then there's another team doing dendrochronology, and they're using a type of isotope analysis, because traditional dendrochronology was just you count the rings and measure the rings to figure out basically how wet or dry that summer was generally, or the year was anyway. But now they actually can study the isotopes of the wood to get a much more higher resolution data for what that year was like, the growing conditions for the tree in that year. So all of that, if anyone's interested, you can reach us at that website, and they will be able to give you much better sort of scientific description. But yeah, even on our own project, there are advances in sedimentology, dendroclimatology, and historical ecology all going on right now. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic stuff. I think as you said before, it's so exciting to see like where this field is going to go in a few years' time. Like even if this is the kind of stuff that we're doing now, like as the field progresses, it's going to be fantastic to see. And for the viewers at home as well, I can absolutely second checking out Environments of Change is a fantastic resource if you're interested in environmental history. Moving back to the Middle Ages, I was interested by something you mentioned at the start, how people in the past perhaps viewed environments in different ways to ourselves in the present day. And do you get a sense of this in medieval Europe, that people perhaps viewed the environment and climate in a different way to individuals in the present day?
Well, yeah, I think in many cases, the issues they faced are similar to the issues that we face in any sort of, when you rely on agriculture to grow your food. Of course, like certain things are constant, but also, yeah, our worldview changes. So for example, their understanding of the world was based on humoral theory. So based on the four elements and whether things are hot or cold or wet or dry, and everything is part of this sort of cosmological order to the universe that is based on balancing. It's all about an idea of balance, right? So if you're sick or if there's something going on environmentally, it's in their mind, probably it's some imbalance of temperature or humidity. And so that's just a very different idea of our view of it, right? Our view of it is based very much on a sort of modern Western scientific perspective. And we see that, in many cases, what we the way we approach the situation, the way they would approach the situation are actually quite similar, but we just have a different sort of articulation of what that would be. And then, of course, they also had a theological understanding of the universe. So when there is a disaster, it's somehow created by a supernatural force that is either to punish people for wrongdoing or as part of some greater cosmic plan or something like that. But there's this whole the causality. There's a different idea of causality. There's a different idea of how things are balanced, and then also in terms of speaking of just disease again, or of managing environments, they had this idea of miasma, which is that they thought that disease was transmitted through bad smell, which in a sense is actually quite logical. They just had it reversed in that things that make you sick often smell bad. It's not the bad smell that makes you sick, but if you avoid things that smell bad, the body has a natural disgust reaction to bad smell for a healthy reason, right? And so they actually were quite effective at regulating, at managing things that we would do now in terms of, quarantining people and trying to keep waste away from people. They didn't know about germ theory, let's say, but in many cases, they weren't the dirty, superstitious places that sometimes I think modern people think that they were, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You get that sort of popular trope of kind of medieval cities being these absolute cesspools. Yeah, absolutely. But I can well appreciate that, that was sort of far from the case. And it's really interesting. I think particularly that theory of humors and the kind of balance. It did make me think a little bit about sort of some of the issues that we're facing now. And if you'll forgive the slightly cliched question for a topic such as this, is there anything you think that we can sort of learn from studying medieval Europe and its climate history to approach the challenges that we face today?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So the first two things that come to mind, one would be a thing that they that they struggled with that we should remember, was that the Great European Famine, for example, which was, of course, very much a product of these harvest failures and a lack of, just lack of food production, partly by perhaps relying too much on monoculture, and our society focuses even more on monoculture. So we're setting ourselves up for a potential disaster in that way. But also it was an issue of food distribution, and they didn't have the means to, they didn't have, motorized vehicles and airplanes and all these things to move food around. And we do, and we still, most modern famines are at least exacerbated, if not caused, by distribution problems. And so we should take a lesson from them, in that they really suffered because they couldn't distribute food as well as they would have, as much as it would have helped them. But we have the means to do it, and in many cases we don't. And so we should take that as a lesson, I think, that we're not totally immune to these problems. And then on the flip side, I would say one thing that they did very well, without all the tools and knowledge that we've been able to accumulate since then, is that they realized they had this horrible deforestation crisis. And throughout most of Europe, they just decided, okay, we have to, and it wasn't like one grand decision. It was just everybody realized, okay, we need this wood. We need to conserve it. We need to figure out ways to conserve it. And so we're going to start coppicing. We're going to start using different methods to actually grow the wood. But we're also going to make sure that we have clear regulations for how much people are actually cutting down the wood. And we're going to plant trees. And there's this great sort of conservation movement, even though they wouldn't have called it that, that's done at the grassroots level without any modern, without the internet to discuss these ideas, without modern tools and machines to actually help with any of it. And they were quite successful. And so if they could do it,
Mhm.
Why why can't we? You know what I mean? It seems like uh such a it should be a fixable problem. I know it's much more complex than just everybody deciding
Mhm.
to save the forests, but we need to learn some lessons from that, I think.
Oh, quite right. Yeah. And I think what
Yeah.
really struck me about that was the fact that, as you say, like there was this enormous, appreciate that it was not quite a big kind of centralized endeavor, but there was this big groundswell in many different cultures of
Yeah.
realizing that there was a need to conserve the resources that they had. And this idea
Yeah.
that if they took care of the environment, they would take care of their own societies in turn.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think that's extraordinary. I think that's definitely something that we can take forward
Yeah.
today. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Definitely. And I suppose, out of curiosity, are there any parts of this period that still require more study, or areas that you want to kind of sort of dive more into over the course of your own research?
Um, yeah, that's I mean, there's always more to study. I mean, I've delved into what's probably one of the most popular centuries to study for the Middle Ages, the 14th, because it is just so sort of sensational and so that is being very well studied. But then again, if you had asked people 20 years ago, has the Black Death been done, people probably would have said, yeah, we pretty much figured it out. And now all of a sudden there's this incredible new research coming out all the time about the origins of it and how it spread and everything. Um, so it's hard to say for sure. I think there, let me think. I mean, I guess part of what I try to say at the end there is I'm interested in looking at the not the big things, more at the regular
Mhm.
day to day, which I think sometimes gets lost. And so, and there is research happening on this now, and I hope to sort of be involved with it. The sort of is the next step. But looking at sort of, well, let's look at the peasants more because the lords create so much more documentation. And they have so much more wealth and power. It's easier to study the lords, but the peasants are most of the people in the population. And so
Mhm.
looking more at, well, what did they have in their homes and like how did their farms actually work and how did they weather these crises and how much access did they have to different resources and maybe luxury goods, even like we're starting to get this great movement of trade throughout Eurasia.
Mhm.
And a little bit after this time, we start to get conspicuous consumption where people start showing off, I have all these different outfits and I have all these things in my house, and sort of a less functional use of objects. And so looking at sort of when does that start and how much does that permeate down into the just the regular everyday peasant in the Middle Ages, right? I think that's the sort of aspect that
Mhm.
I think is most interesting. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think it'd be brilliant, Sam, to do some more research in their field, especially one because they were kind of the majority of the population. But
Yeah.
dare I say as well, would I be right to think that changes in climate and shifts sort of affected different classes in different ways as it sort of does today?
Oh, I think definitely. And that's something that we should look at, like we'll need to look at more. One example would be drainage, which I spoke about, is
Hmm.
elites were much better able to mobilize resources to protect their properties and to drain areas if they wanted, and to sort of enforce rules on, like basically forcing tenants to say preserve infrastructure that was important to them. So my feeling is, and I think this is not a controversial, or this is a pretty well supported thing to say, that all these crises struck the poor people much worse, right? As it would
Hmm.
today.
Yeah.
And so if you're a peasant farmer living in that marshland that I described, good luck, right?
Hmm.
You're gonna struggle. Where the lords had all these other tools available to them. They could convert the land into something else. They could have people build barriers for them. They could pay someone to do it. So I think they were much more able to withstand uh and I mean food also, they had barns to store food, surplus food and all these things. So yeah, there's definitely a class-based difference there, I think, for sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
And a final question from me. If our viewers want to learn more about environmental history and climate change in the Middle Ages, where would be the best places for them to start to read and learn about that?
Well, so medieval-environment.com, like I said, we're always happy to sort of have people reach out to us. But if they wanted, I'd say if they wanted one introductory book to lay it all out, would be Richard Hoffman's An Environmental History of Medieval Europe. That is a phenomenal book and is the great sort of, and he's sort of the pioneer of medieval environmental history. That would probably be the best one. Also, there's Bruce Campbell's The Great Transition, which came out a couple years after that, which is another, which has a little bit more of, just a little bit less of a sort of survey of the topic and makes sort of a stronger argument. But that, yeah, they're both of great interest, I think. But I would start with, yeah, Hoffman's Environmental History of Medieval Europe is must read material.
Absolutely. Good stuff.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I'm afraid that brings us to the end of our time together. Andrew, thanks so
Yeah.
much. This has been a fantastic discussion, really fascinating stuff.
Thank you very
Um, Good stuff. I'd like to thank everybody at home as well. If you're interested, please do check out Environments of Change. It's a fantastic resource, really interesting research that's being pumped out there. So yes, thanks very much, everybody, and we'll see you all in the next episode. Thanks very much. Take care.
Take care.